Hey guys, this video is going to go over the origin of the species and how species get created or speciation occurs. By the way, the noise that you're hearing in the background is my ceiling fan, so sorry about that. And the new pen came in, so let's see if I can actually write with it. I think it looks better than the last time. So here we go. Origin of the species. So an interesting fact, Darwin never actually put down how a new species came about. His book was called The Origin of the Species, but it was all about natural selection and evolution. He never really talked about how we get a new species of tiger, or a new species of bunny rabbit, or whatever. So we're going to go through and I will tell you who did. So remember that guy that I told you I got to meet a long time ago, Ernst Mayr? He's the one who came up with what we call the biological species concept. And pretty much he defined what a species is. He says it's a population, or he said, sorry, it's a population whose members can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. So in other words, there had to be reproductive compatibility there. I have to be able to recognize you as potential mate. I have to be able to have children with you, and then those children have to go on, and they themselves should be able to have children later on in life. So again, that's the species concept. It's pretty much what a species is. So how do we get new species? Well, here's what has to happen first of all. A population must exist. And then once that population is there, it has to become isolated. And isolation can happen in two ways, either geographical or reproductive. So something physically prevents us from getting to one another, some kind of geographic barrier, or reproductively, we don't understand that we can mate with each other. So the two ways that a population becomes isolated is through geographical means or reproductive means. Once the population has become isolated, then here's what's going to happen. That population is going to evolve independent of the new population. The two of them keep growing and keep evolving, but they're not doing it together. So behaviors change. Their ways of life changes. Maybe where they live and what they eat changes. So inherently, the species itself changes. So we can take isolation and break it down into two main topics, allopatric isolation and sympatric isolation. I like to think of them as living in a different country or living in the same country. So allopatric isolation is pretty much geographic separation. We've moved to a whole nother country. We can't actually reproduce because I live in Spain and you live in Germany. Whereas sympatric isolation, we still live in the same country, but for whatever reasons, we no longer identify each other as being potential mates or being members of the same species. Then the clincher is if two independent populations ever came back together and they could once more mate, then technically there was never a new species formed. But if the two populations come back and they still don't recognize each other as potential mates and no reproduction takes place, then we have two new species being formed. Okay, so I am going to add in a slide. Alright, so what I'm going to show you now is going to go over sympatric isolation. Geographic is pretty easy to get, either like there's a mountain there or there isn't. Sympatric's a little bit more challenging because technically all of the organisms are right there in contact with each other. So why would they even feel the need to, separate or to speciate? Before we can do that, though, I need to take you back through a little physics and chemistry lesson. So let's look at the physics of light. You should know that white is comprised of three primary colors, and they are red, green, and blue. And that colors of light, not pigments, but colors of light, are based on wavelength. The wavelength acts on the frequency, and the frequency and the wavelength together correspond to the energy that particular color of light carries. So what does this have to do with anything? Well, when you look at a body of water, normally the color we see is blue. Water always looks blue to us. And it's because of how water molecules react in the presence of different colors of light. So let's see if I can draw with this new pen. So this is what a water molecule, hold on. This is what a water molecule looks like. It is a polar molecule because this hydrogen up here is positive, whereas these oxygens here are negative. So the primary source of light in the world comes from the sun. When the sun shines, that's a pretty orange sun, but you get the point. When the sun shines on a body of water, two things happen. The water molecules are going to take the red colors out of sunlight, and they will be absorbed. So water absorbs reddish light. Whereas blue light is going to be reflected. Okay, so all of the red light's being absorbed. This blue light is the one that's left alone. So this is our body of water, which is why water looks blue. So water looks blue because it absorbs red light, but it leaves the blue light alone. This only works if the water is clear. So if you notice, water that has sediment in it doesn't look that blue. Okay, so this process, this section right here that we just talked about, that only works if the water is clear. Now what happens when water has sediment in it? Well, when water has sediment in it, mixed in with those water molecules are sediment molecules. And sediment molecules behave differently from water molecules. So what's going to happen is sediment is going to absorb blue light and leave red light alone. So blue light is absorbed by sediment. Whoops, wrong molecule there. Blue light is absorbed by sediment, and instead the red light is what's left behind. So you're probably thinking, okay, Ms. Courtney, this is really cool, but why do we care? Here's why we care. A lot of animals live in water, and the way that these light particles react with water molecules are going to influence the color of the water that they live in. So the general rule of thumb is if a body of water has sediment in it, then the water on the surface is going to be blue. Or at least it's going to look blue. Whereas the water on the bottom is instead going to be red or reddish. This is going to impact any animal that lives in that water. So it means that fish that live in these bodies of water are going to change their behavior, and in theory their evolution will also change based on the kind of water that they live in, which is going to, and that is influenced by the kind of light that that water receives. So remember when we talked about our cichlids, and we've been watching those videos, which we will finish. I think we have like 2 left. I told you there are like 500 species of cichlids. They're all brightly colored, but they live in different parts of these lakes in the Great Rift Valley. So the way it's going to work is if a fish is sensitized or tuned to blue light, they're going to have an advantage in shallower water because that's where the blue light's going to be. But if a fish is sensitized to red light, they're going to live in deeper waters because, again, that's where the advantage for them would lie. That's where the red light is going to be, because the closer you are to the bottom, the more silt and sediment you have, so the less blue light is getting down into those regions. So another way to think of this is by living in different parts of the habitat, natural selection is going to favor the turning on or turning off of different genes. This is pretty much how resource partitioning develops, okay? Because all of these fish are sharing the same generalized area, but they all have their little niche, and they don't really get into anyone else or any other fish's way. So now let's add the combination of sexual selection to this scenario. You're going to have male fish that have a variety of colors, but mostly what you're going to see are lots of reds and lots of blues. You're also going to have female fish who tend to be not as brightly colored, but they're more attracted to the brightly colored males. So even though the females are really going to be looking for brightly colored fish, you have to take into consideration where they live and the colors that they are sensitized to and attracted to. If you have a blue male fish that lives deep down in that body of water, he's going to have a lot of trouble finding a mate because there's not a lot of blue light. So right away, he's not going to look as brightly colored as the red males, and most of the females will pass him by because he doesn't stand out to them. And the second issue is that the females who live in deeper waters are not as sensitized to blue light, so they're going to go for the red fish more often anyway. So over a lot of time, an influence of this sexual selection, but also this predisposition that our fish have to certain kinds of light, are going to act on the entire population of fish. And you're going to see two parts of the population diverge. Even though they're living right there in the same lake, right next to each other, certain fish will only mate with certain fish. Our blue fishes will be attracted to each other. Our red fishes will be attracted to each other. This is sympatric isolation or sympatric speciation. Nothing really has changed about the environment they live in. Like, there's no physical barrier or reason why they can't be together. It's more of I can't think of a word. Hold on. Okay, I thought of the word. It's more of a preference. So it's not a physical thing, it's just a preference. And they've evolved that preference. Alright, so here's just a picture kind of showing you what I meant. All of our blue fish are going to be gathered close to the top. That's where the blue light is. That's where they can see each other and recognize each other as potential mates. Whereas our red fish are going to be along the bottom because, again, that's where they can see each other. That's where their preference lies. If this fish decided to swim up into this blue fish region, he wouldn't be successful. He wouldn't have any mates. Same thing if this blue fish decided to swim down into this red fish zone. Okay, sorry about the distorted pictures. So now we're going to talk about pre-reproductive barriers. And these are going to be obstacles that either prevent mating, or if mating does happen, it prevents fertilization. So all of this ties into how speciation occurs. If any of these things take place, you're going to have the formation of a new species. Okay, so let's start with geographic isolation. It's where the species occurs in the same place, in the same area, but there is some kind of physical barrier that prevents them from coming together and mating. So this would be allopatric speciation. And here's an example. This little guy is a squirrel. He's called a Harris antelope squirrel, and there are two species of them. They both are found in the Grand Canyon, but one's found on the left-hand side, or the northern rim, and the other one is found in the south rim. The barrier would be this huge cannon. They can't get across the cannon to each other. Now, if you look at them, they look very, very similar. At first glance, you'd think that they're all one big happy family, but these two will not mate because they can never get together to mate. So they've evolved as two separate species. Okay, another example of pre-reproductive isolation, or barrier, would be ecological isolation. So this one is going to be sympatric speciation. There's no barrier, there's no physical barrier. These species live in the same place, but they occupy different habitats. So they don't really come into contact with each other. They're never around each other. So they are reproductively isolated. Okay, so here's an example. You have two kinds of snakes. They're both garter snakes, but they're two different species. This guy is terrestrial. He lives on the land, but he doesn't like the water. This guy is aquatic. He lives in the water and hardly ever gets on land. The two of them will never mate because they never come into contact with each other. We've talked about this one before, the whole lions and tigers thing. Technically, they do produce offspring. We've done that in captivity. But lions prefer grasslands. Tigers prefer rainforests. the distance isn't that great that they couldn't meet each other, but because they don't like where, the other lives, they're never going to wander that far. A lion isn't going to just start living in a rainforest all of a sudden and start mating with a tiger. So this would be ecological isolation. Okay, then there's temporal isolation. So this is going to be another example of sympatric. Whoops. Okay, so this is when species breed during different times of the day, or maybe during different seasons, or even during different years. So again, they never meet each other. They can't reproduce with each other. The example we have here is the eastern spotted skunk and the western spotted skunk. Their range overlaps. The two of them live in the same area, but the eastern skunk, the eastern skunk, this guy right here, he only mates in the late winter, whereas our western skunk, this guy right here, likes to mate in the summertime. So never going to meet up because not the same time. It's temporal isolation. Okay, then there's behavioral isolation. This again is going to be sympatric, and it's where individual species have evolved unique behaviors and rituals that they use to communicate with each other. It helps them to identify members of the same species, and it also helps to attract mates from the same species. So this could be things like ritual dances or courtship calls or mating calls, all of which would say, hey, I am a part of your species and I can mate with you. So this is another example of reproductive isolation. These guys would never mate with each other because they don't understand what this individual is trying to do. There's a type of bird called a booby, and they come in a couple of varieties. The most famous is the blue-footed booby, and they have a very special dance that they do to attract their mate. And they lean from side to side, and they lift their head and point their beak skywards and then flex their wings. And all of this is in an effort to say, I'm attracted to you. Are you attracted to me? Now, if I were a finch and this blue-footed booby started doing this dance in front of me, I'd probably think that he was having epilepsy. I wouldn't realize that he was trying to attract me as a mate. So because we are two different species, we kind of don't speak the same language. We can't communicate with each other, so therefore we can't mate with each other. Okay, so here are just some more examples of how behavioral isolation would take place. These guys are gray-crowned cranes. They're a species found in Kenya, and they also have a very elaborate courtship display. Here we have fireflies or lightning bugs that actually flash their little abdomen lights in a specific frequency, all in an attempt to attract a mate. And by the way, only the males flash. The females don't flash. Okay, then there's mechanical isolation. Again, sympatric. Mechanical isolation is when we have some kind of morphological feature, some structure that prevents successful mating. So sometimes even in species that are closely related, and we tend to see this in plants a lot, they're going to have very distinctive appearances that only attract certain pollinators. And if you are not my immediate pollinator, then you don't fit, and you can't pollinate me, thereby I can't reproduce. Here's an example, and this one's very memorable. For a lot of insects, it boils down to the actual shape and size and all of that of the male and female reproductive parts. If the species are closely related, then their parts just don't fit together. They literally cannot physically fit together, so they can't reproduce. A damselfly you can think of him as a smaller version of a dragonfly, but that's what his male reproductive parts look like. Very, very intricate. They're designed only to fit into certain female damselflies. Everyone can't necessarily mate with him because of these very specific morphological shapes. This, I promise you will always remember. Okay, then there's gametic isolation, and it's where, so we've made sperm and we've made eggs, and we've actually been able to reproduce, but the sperm of one species may not be able to fertilize the egg of another species. And this happens through two ways. The first is through what we call a biochemical barrier, where the sperm cannot penetrate the egg. So around the egg, there is some kind of mechanism where the sperm and the egg must fit together in a certain way, or there are certain kinds of receptors that have to be triggered so that the sperm can penetrate the egg. And if those don't exist, then the sperm can never get into the egg, DNA can never be put together. Technically, we haven't been fertilized. The other way is through what we call chemical incompatibility, where the sperm cannot survive inside of the female because the conditions are either too acidic or too basic, and the sperm doesn't, it just can't make it. It doesn't like those conditions. Sea urchins have a very interesting way of doing their reproduction. They don't actually have a mechanical way of reproducing. The male sea urchins just release their sperm into the surrounding water, and the females release their eggs into the surrounding water, and in the water is where the sperm and the eggs fuse together. But gametes of different species are unable to fuse with each other, so that way you don't have a whole bunch of different hybrid sea urchins running around. Okay, so we've just looked at barriers that would prevent reproduction from happening at all. But sometimes nature finds a way. So reproduction takes place, and now we have some kind of offspring. Well, there are barriers that will also prevent that offspring from either being viable or being fertile, and those are called post-reproductive barriers. Don't forget, the definition of a species says that it has to be individuals who can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. So two classic examples of hybrid offspring are zebroids. Oh, sorry, forgot my pen. Zebroids, here we go. And mules. So let's go through it. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. So reduced hybrid viability is the first kind of post-reproductive barrier. And it's where genes of different parent species may interact and impair the hybrid's development. So you have an actual offspring, but that offspring doesn't develop properly, so the organism itself probably doesn't live for very long. Or if they do live, they're really, really weak and really, really frail, and they'll never live long enough to produce offspring of their own. So that is reduced hybrid viability. Then there's reduced hybrid fertility. So sometimes you make offsprings that are actually a really good mix of both parents. So a mule, for example, gets the best of both worlds. He is the offspring of a horse and of a donkey. He is the intelligence of the horse and the strength of the donkey and the speed of the horse as well. So really good animal, really vigorous, but they're sterile. They can't produce offspring of their own, even if they do mate. So one of the reasons this happens is because the chromosomes, moving the slide around, because the chromosomes of the parents may differ in number. Like, for example, humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Not every organism has that. So a horse might have 48 pairs of chromosomes, and a donkey might have 49, which means that there's going to be a chromosome left without a partner from, either the male side or the female side, which means that mitosis and all of that isn't going to happen as normal, and it's not going to produce, meiosis isn't going to happen as normal, and it's not going to produce normal gametes, so the mule can't reproduce. Okay, then the last one is called hybrid breakdown, and it's where you have hybrid organisms, we see this in plants a lot, that may be fertile, and they may be viable the very first time you mate them, so in their first generation. But then when they have offspring, the offspring are feeble or sterile. So initially the hybrid looks like it's a successful organism, it's fertile, and it's viable, but when they mate, the offspring produced are feeble or sterile. They don't live long enough to mate for themselves, or they can't mate at all. Okay, now I want to talk to you about two terms called cladogenesis and angiogenesis. We're getting to the point where we're going to start talking about evolution holistically. So angiogenesis is the accumulation of changes in a species that leads to another species. So we're saying that we started off as this bird right, We started off as this bird right here, and then we went through a whole series of changes until we ended up being this bird right here. So it's like saying this was the original, and this is the descendant, or the current. Okay? It's just straight evolution, straight from one species, straight to the other species. But then there's this other term called cladiogenesis, where we kind of have what we call budding off, where more than one new species can be formed from one ancestral species. So we again started off as this bird, that's our original or our ancestral species. And that ancestral species continues to exist, but along the way, we've had a different species that originated. So in angiogenesis, we just go from the ancestral species to the descendant species. And in cladogenesis, the ancestral species is still around, but then we budded off, or we made a new species, a new descendant species in the process. So over the years, there have been a lot of arguments as to how quickly does evolution or even speciation happen. Is it a gradual process, or is it all or nothing? A lot of people lean to the theory of gradualism, which is the one over here on the left, where it shows we have an ancestral species that slowly over time developed some slight changes, and now we have two different species, maybe even some species being formed along the way. So it's just an accumulation, a slow accumulation of simple little changes. The shape of my wing, the colors of my feathers, how long my legs are. So just lots of little changes that all accumulate eventually into a big change. The other theory is called punctuated equilibrium, where it says we have rapid bursts of change and then periods of time where there is no change. So we start off as one individual, and for a while we exist as that one type of species, and then something happens and we make some changes. And then we exist again for a period of time before something else happens and we make some more changes. So this is saying that we have lots of little, gradualism, is saying we have lots of little tiny changes along the way. And punctuated equilibrium is saying that we have long periods of no change at all, and then a sudden burst or sudden mixture of alleles cause a change. Right, so again, these are just the words, so now you can actually write down something. You can always go back to the slide or pause it if you need to. I'm going to move ahead because this slide talks about exactly what I just talked about in the previous. Okay, so let's talk about extinctions. An extinction is what happens when an entire species dies. There is no live representative, no living individual that represents that species. There have been 5 major extinctions throughout Earth's history, and they've affected different things. Like the first couple only affected marine life because guess what? That's the only place we had life. Nothing was alive on the Earth yet. Then around 251 million years ago, about 90% of all of our species died out. So that was like our first great mass extinction. About 200 years ago, million years ago, we had another massive or major extinction where we had both marine and terrestrial animals die out. And then, of course, the one that most people are familiar with, about 65 million years ago, we had this massive extinction where 99% of our dinosaurs died out and about 80% of other animals died as well. Alright, so this is the end of it. Hope it wasn't too long this time. See you guys soon. Bye.